Hey guys, what is going on? Sourav here back with another video, and in this one I am going to be talking about FastAPI, and I'll use FastAPI to build a simple OCR application web app which looks something like this. So it's a pretty simple web app which, as the name suggests, it performs OCR on an image. For those of you who don't know what OCR is it's basically extracting text from images. So in order to demonstrate what I mean, here is a picture which contains some text inside. Obviously, I can't copy this text or edit it. But if I choose this image and upload it to my web app, the application will convert it into actual text which I can copy and then edit. This is gonna be a tutorial for FastAPI, although I'm not going to dive very deep into it, but I will be talking about a certain few features of FastAPI which I absolutely love. FastAPI is a relatively new Python framework for developing REST APIs, and it is along the same lines kind of as Flask and Django, but it offers a lot of interesting features which make it, I would say in my opinion, a better choice, at least for making RESTful APIs. So first up, FastAPI is actually fast, as the name suggests. It uses Python static typing, which was introduced in the later versions of Python 3, and it also uses a bunch of optimizations at the server level to make deployment faster as well as serving requests faster. It also offers a lot of neat features like automatic documentation, which will automatically generate Swagger documentation based on the APIs which you write in the code. And for those of you who have worked on making RESTful APIs, you know how important and equally frustrating it is to write the documentation for your APIs. Another neat feature is that FastAPI provides support for asynchronous API calls, which is not inbuilt in Flask or Django. Using async API calls, you can make your web app much more responsive and scalable if your user base is really large. And also it has support for background tasks and other few things which I will be talking about in detail in this video later on. So that's enough of talk. Let's jump right into it and start writing some code. So first of all, you would need to install FastAPI on your machine, and it is as simple as doing a pip install. You would also need to install a web server program like uvicorn. Once you do have these packages installed, we can go ahead and write some code. So first of all, we can import FastAPI, and then in order to initialize an application, we can say app equals FastAPI, and that will initialize the whole application. And using this app object, we will define our routes to the web app. So let us first of all decide what we want our application to do. So number one, I would want to serve a HTML file so that I can use the user interface. The second thing which I would want my web app to do is to have a endpoint or an API which would receive an image, perform OCR on it, and then return the text back to me. So that is going to be a post call. So let us first write the code for serving the plain HTML file. So in order to do that, we can import Ginger2 templates from fastapi.templating, and then we can define the place where our application will look for these templates. So we can say templates equals Ginger2 templates, and then the directory would be the location of the directory where we have our HTML files. So in my case, as you can see, I have no HTML files as of now. So I will create a new folder over here. I'll call it templates, and inside that I will make a new file and I'll call it index.html. So if I have this index.html file, I'm just going to put hello over there for now, and I will now define a route which will read this index.html file and serve it. So we can simply say app.get. It's going to be a get call, and the location of this get call would just be the home location or the base location, and then we can just say def home. In order to return an HTML file, we can just say return templates.template response, and then the name of the HTML file which we have. So in our case, it's index.html, and then an object which points to the request object. So what is this request object here? This would be a standard request object which FastAPI provides. So we need to import that as well. So we will simply say from FastAPI import request as well, and that request would be a default parameter to our home function over here. For those of you who don't know, this is a relatively newer syntax in Python, which is just basically a parameter like how we have for normal functions. It is just that we are predefining the data type of that request object. So this is basically saying I will receive a variable called request, and that variable will be of the type request, and this request is a class which FastAPI provides. So in order to start our local server, we can just say uvicorn server. So this is the name of the Python file, and here we can say app, which is the object inside our server.py which contains our entire application. And then we can also pass in an extra argument called reload, which would automatically reload the server whenever we make any changes in our Python code. The server has been started on the 8000 port in our local host. So let's open our web browser and visit that URL, and as we can see, it serves a simple hello over there. So now the next order of business would be to write a simple HTML file which would provide us the functionality of attaching an image and then hitting the submit button, which would in turn return us the extracted text. Okay, so I've made a simple index.html file, which is just a plain old file which has a button and a place for you to attach your file. So yeah, this is the index.html which I just wrote using a few lines of HTML code, and please bear with me, I'm not a very good UI dev. So pretty much all of my web apps look the same because I use Bootstrap in all of them, because for me it is the simplest way of making a UI look like decent. But yeah, so now that we have defined this index.html, our server.py will return us this index.html whenever we hit the base URL. So our next order of business would be to define another API endpoint, and this endpoint would be the one which would take in an image and perform OCR and then return back the response. So this should be a post API call, so we can say app.post, and I would want to call the API as /extract text, and then this would perform the function of extracting, or let's say performing OCR on our image file. So what would be the parameter to this function? So like I mentioned earlier, we will be attaching an image payload to this post endpoint. We would also define the expected data type of our image, which would be an upload file. And what is this upload file? So upload file is a special data type which is provided by FastAPI again. We can just say image has to be of the type upload file. For those of you who are wondering what is this three dots over here, it is actually a Python data type called ellipses, which even I didn't know of till a couple of days back. So if we open a Python shell, right, and if we just hit dot dot dot, you can see it actually means ellipses. It's actually a data type which is present in Python, which is basically used for a placeholder mostly. However, there are some special use cases which we can see in other libraries like NumPy. But either way, this is just a placeholder over here, and this would initialize the file object for us and store it in the image variable. And we can just use this image variable like how we would use any file pointer in Python. So when we do get this image, our first order of business would be to store this image or download this image on our server. So I'm going to do that by making a helper function. I'm going to call it save file to disk, which will take in a couple of parameters. It will take the file object, it will take in the path where it should save the file, and save as would be the name which should be given to this file when it is being saved. Now this function is pretty simple, right? It should just save the file to the local machine. So that is what we're going to be doing using shutil. So we need to import that as well. So shutil is a standard Python library which does not have to be installed, and we'll also import OS. So this function is pretty simple. It just takes in all the parameters given to it, and it opens an empty file with the same name which we had given over here, and copies the file object to our new file and then returns the name of the file which was just saved. So now that we have our name of the file which was saved, we can simply pass it to a OCR function to perform OCR on this file. So we can just say text equals OCR dot read image, and then we'll also pass in the file path, and this will return us the text which was there inside the image. So what is this OCR over here? So I've already defined a OCR library which uses PyTesseract to perform OCR on an image, and I've defined a small helper library over here which I am going to import and then use it over here as the read function. If you want to know more about how I made this OCR library, you can check out this video over here. So now we just have to define what the return type of this API should be. So APIs, they return a JSON response, and FastAPI will encode a dictionary as a JSON response. So we can just say return over here, we can say file name, which was image dot file name, and the text would be text. So now we have our API defined at the back end, but we also have to call this API when we do want to perform OCR from the front end. So for that, I'm back to my index.html file. And as you can see over here, we have a button defined which the user would press to perform the action of extracting the text. So on the onClick function of that button, I have called the function perform OCR, which is defined over here, which is currently empty. But inside this function, we would need to, one, get the file which was selected by the user. Number two, make a form data with that image. And number three, call our API which we have defined over here with that image. And number four, take in the response and then show it to the user. So there are four things which we would need to do. So the first part of that is getting the file, which we have done using this line of code. And then we create a new form data object, which is over here. We define what endpoint we want to hit, which is extract text, which we just defined. And then we would append the first file which we had selected in the form data with the name image. Why do we set this as the name image? Because our application or our API expects the data to have the name image. Once we do have that defined, we can make a simple API call using Ajax, which is a part of jQuery, which we have imported over here in this line. And inside the Ajax, our parameters would be pretty simple. So first up is the type of the API call which we need to make. So in our case, it is a post API call. What is the URL which we have to ping, which is our endpoint variable, which we have defined over here. And then what is the data which we need to send in along with this post call, which is our form data object, which contains our image, and then a bunch of other default parameters about cache and content type. And most importantly, we need to define what would happen upon successful calling of this API endpoint. So whatever data comes in, I would just alert the user and print the data.text object inside that JSON. If we go back to our code over here, remember our return type has a text field which has the converted text. So we would just make a pop-up with the name of converted text, and inside the pop-up we would just put in the data.text which has the converted text inside. And this swal is basically a sweetalert.js, which is again one of my favorite go-to libraries for making your alerts look better, which we have also imported over here. So let me quickly go back to our server. So if I refresh this, one, I should be able to see a better UI, and two, I should be able to attach an image, and it should also perform OCR on it. So the UI seems to work fine. Let me select an image, which in our case would be this image file. I'm going to choose that and I'm going to hit extract text. And obviously something didn't work out. Okay, no such file or directory temp.png. Okay, so if you remember, we had defined the path where the image should be saved to be temp, and temp folder does not currently exist. So I'll just make a new folder and call it temp, so that we have a location where we can store that image. Let's refresh this page and let's try that again one last time. Cool. So as we can see, it finally performs OCR. It makes a nice beautiful pop-up using Sweet Alert, and we can see that the converted text is present inside this box. That is one major part of our web app which is complete. And now we're going to talk about how we can make this more responsive and more scalable if this becomes a big web app. Earlier in the video, I'd mentioned that FastAPI also supports asynchronous API calls, and that is exactly what we will be doing to our extract text API in order to make it more responsive to users. But before we can do that, we need to know what exactly an async call is, right? So imagine if you have a function which takes a long time to run. If you make this function an async function, then while the Python compiler is waiting for this function to complete its execution, the compiler can go ahead and finish other tasks which it has queued up. So this would make your web application more responsive in that if there is one API call which is taking a long time, instead of blocking all the other users, it would serve all the other API calls which other users are making concurrently. So to make our extract text API and async API, we just have to say async def, and our major point of this function which takes a long time to execute is the OCR function, right? So we would put an await over here. So await is again a Python keyword which was introduced in the later versions of Python, which basically tells this function that this is an async function, and while I'm waiting for the read image function to complete execution, I am awaiting for the function to get over. In that time, if anyone else is pinging any other API, for example, if user number 2 is pinging this API, I would not block him. I would go ahead and service all those remaining APIs while I'm waiting for this OCR function to complete. So once this read image function has completed execution, the control gets passed on back to this line of code and our API would return us this response. But there is a small catch over here. We cannot simply await any function. This function which we are awaiting should also be an async function. So in order to do that, I will go over to my OCR code and make the read image function as an async function as well. So using FastAPI, you can make your API calls asynchronous in this fashion. So when a large number of users are using your API at the same time, it makes a lot of sense to make the heavy duty API calls which take a long time to execute asynchronous. This would not only benefit in the user experience, but it would also help your application scale to really large numbers. Another feature which we can add to our application to increase its responsiveness is to add support for background tasks. Now imagine if a user chooses many different image files to be processed in one go, right? So I can select multiple different images and give it to my API to process it. Even if we modified this API to handle many images at once, it would still be a problem because the user would have to wait for minutes on end just to get a response back from the API. This is not good for multiple reasons. Number one, it is obviously not a good user experience. Number two, it is not recommended to have an API connection open for that long. And number three, this would not scale when a lot of different users are sending in a lot of images at the same time. So to solve that, FastAPI gives us built-in support for adding background tasks. A background task is basically a task which you queue or schedule to run in the background while returning the API response beforehand. So what I mean by that is, imagine if a user gives the OCR app 100 different images. As soon as the API call is made, we queue a new background task which would take care of processing all of these 100 images in the background. And as soon as we queue that task, we return a successful API response back to the user so that the user knows that the task has been scheduled and is running in the background, as opposed to making the user wait until all the 100 images have completed processing. So in order to add that functionality to our application, I would make a new API route. This would still be a post call, but we would call it bulk extract text because we can give it multiple images at once. And this would also be an async call for similar reasons. So I'll say async def and let's call it bulk perform OCR. And since this does not take in a single image, it takes in multiple images, we cannot just define a single image over here. So we will just get the API request for now and find those images inside that request. And in order to make this a background task, we can say bg underscore tasks and the type of that would be background tasks. So this background tasks is a class which is exposed by FastAPI to enable the user to queue background tasks. So inside this function, we will use the request object to get all the images. So I will say images equals and await request dot form. So again, I'm doing await over here because this extraction of the form data from the request might take a long time. So just in case, we're adding an await over there. And once we do have the images, we can iterate over them and save them to disk and then also schedule the OCR to be run on them in the background. So first up would be saving those images to our local machines. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a unique folder. For that, I'll just import UUID over here. So UUID is basically, it just returns a very unique and random ID which is guaranteed to be unique. So I'll just make a unique ID and make a folder with that name just to give it a unique name. So this UUID will also be our task ID against which we will queue our background task and use this task ID to extract the results later on. You will see what I mean when we code our subsequent functions. So I'll make a new folder with that UUID using os.mkdir function, and for every image in my request data, right, I will use the same function which is a save file to disk function to save that image to our special folder which we just made, and we'll give it the original name which it came with. And now comes the part where we queue our OCR to be run in the background, because that is the most time consuming process, right? So for that, I will simply say bgtask.add task. So bgtask is, again, it is an object of this class. So we will say add a new task, and now we simply say what is the task to be run and what are the parameters required by that task. So in my ocr.py library, I have exposed a simple function called read images from dir function, which basically takes in a directory and performs OCR on all of the images inside that directory. So I will simply call that function. I will give it the same folder name in which all of our images are stored, and I will also give it another parameter which is write to file. Using this parameter, the function will write all of the outputs to a separate text file in that folder. Once the background task has been queued or scheduled, we can simply return a response, and the response for me is going to be a task ID, which is the UUID which we had defined, which is also the folder name. And for more information, we can also pass in the number of files which we have registered. So to reiterate, this API call would not take a long time to run, because we are queuing the most intensive task in the background and immediately returning a response to the user. So now that we have this API route defined, we need to take care of it in the front end as well. So I'll move back to index.html and modify our perform OCR function to handle this new API. So over here in our perform OCR function, instead of having a single endpoint, we will dynamically assign the endpoint based on the number of files which the user has selected. If the user has selected just one file, then we would just call the extract text function like normal. But if the number of files exceeds 1, then we would iterate over each of those files, add it to our form data, and then change the endpoint to be bulk extract text. And over here, it's mostly gonna stay the same. We are still gonna make a post call with that form data, but we have to handle our success function a bit more differently. So now, depending on what the endpoint is, we will display the appropriate message. If the endpoint is extract text, then we will continue showing the same message which we were showing before. If, however, the endpoint is bulk extract text, then we don't have any immediate converted text to show. We'll just say the request has been received, and the converted files will start showing up soon. So let's go over to our code, refresh the page, and try giving it 2 files. And it will tell me that the request has been received and the converted files will be processed soon. But the problem here is that how does the user know if those files have indeed been processed, right? Because we're not showing them here. If, however, we go to our code directory, we can see that a folder has been created with a random ID, and if we open that, we can see that the text has indeed been converted and written to these text files. So we need a mechanism to identify all the text files which have been generated in this folder and then show them one by one to the user periodically. Using the task ID which we had assigned to our background task, we can find out how many images have been converted to text inside of that folder. And to find that out, we can again write a simple get method, and we'll call this bulk output, and we'll also have a task ID as a parameter over here. So given this task ID, we can write a function which takes the task ID as a parameter. And the job of this function is to go to that folder, find out all the files which are present in that directory, and find out how many of them are text files which have been converted from images. So it's pretty straightforward to do that. We will have a dictionary defined and we'll call it text map. And for every file in the directory which has that ID, we will check if that file ends with a .txt. If it does, we will open it and read it and then assign it to the dictionary which we had just created over here. So our dictionary will have key value pairs where the key is the name of the file and the value is the text which it contains. Once we have that created, we can simply return our information as a JSON response. So we will send it the task ID as well as the output, which is the text map which we have defined. Now what I plan to do with this API is that I will ping this API once in every say 3 seconds, and it will identify all the images which have been converted up until that point in time. So coming back to our 100 images example, say the process of extracting text from 100 images takes say 15 minutes. if I ping this API once in every 3 to 5 seconds, I can expect that a few new files would have been converted up until that point in time, so that I can immediately view them in the UI without having to wait for all of the 100 images to show up at once. So now let's come back to our index.html file. So I have defined a couple of new functions over here. One of them being the get converted files function, which takes in the task ID as a parameter and also the number of files against that task ID. And it repeatedly pings the bulk output API endpoint once in every 3 seconds. So this function in JavaScript, the set interval function, can be used to repeatedly perform an activity over a specified interval. So in my case, that interval is 3 seconds, and the activity which I'm performing is pinging the bulk output API to get all the files which have been converted up until that point in time. So we will ping the API using the AJAX call, and when we do get a response back from our API, I will simply show that info back onto my UI using these few lines of code, which basically creates a new element for every text file which has been processed until that point in time. It creates a new element, stores the output in that element, and creates a button out of it so that the user can click it and view the content. Also, I have a small check over here which says that if the length of my output, right, which I get from my API, if the length of that output is equal to the num files which I'm expecting, that means I have received all the files which were queued up against that task ID. So I can stop my checking and I don't have to ping the API anymore. So I'm calling the stop checker function to do exactly that. And the last thing to do would be to call this function over here as soon as we register a new bulk task, and we will give it two parameters. One is the task ID and one is the num files. Now if we go to our server and check out the response which we had actually set for the bulk extract API, we do return these two exact fields as the API response, so we can directly use them over here. So if we come back over here and refresh our page and select multiple images, so I'm going to select 3 images for now and click on extract text, we get the request has been received, and after a few seconds automatically it populates the 3 images one by one. Since it was only 3 images in this example, it took a very little amount of time, and that's why all of them popped up at almost the same time. But if there were many images which takes a long time to process, we can expect that a few new buttons would pop up here every few seconds. So yeah, that's pretty much it what I wanted to cover in this video. So we learned about FastAPI, we learned about how to make get and post calls in FastAPI. We also learned about async calls and background tasks and how to use them practically. If you guys want to know how to deploy your web application onto the cloud for free using Heroku, I would recommend to check this video out where I explain the entire process in a simple way. So that's about it for this video, guys. I hope you really enjoyed it, and like I'm saying, for every video there's a lot of good stuff coming, so please do subscribe, and yeah, thank you.